The Russo Japanese War was a military conflict fought between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan from 1904 to 1905. Much of the fighting took place what is now northeastern China. The Russo Japanese War was also a naval conflict with ships exchanging fire in the waters surrounding the Korean peninsula. The brutal conflict in the Western Pacific changed the balance of power in Asia and set the stage for World War I. In 1904, the Russian Empire was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, was one of the largest territorial powers in the world. However, with the Siberian shipping center of Vladivostok forced to a closed for much of the winter months, the empire was needed of warm water port in the Pacific Ocean, both for the purposes of trade as well as a base for its growing navy. Tsar Nicholas set his sights on the Korean and Liaodong peninsulas, the latter located in present-day China. The Russian Empire already leased a port on the Liaodong Peninsula from China, Port Arthur, but it wanted to have a base of operations firmly under its control. The Japanese, meanwhile, had been concerned about Russian influence in the region since the First Sino-Japanese War of 1895. Russia provided military support of the Qing dynasty in China during that conflict, which pitted the two Asian powers against each other. With the Russians' history of military aggression, the Japanese initially sought a deal offering to cede control of Manchuria, which is northeastern China. Under the terms of the proposal, Japan would have maintained influence over Korea. However, Russia refused Japan's offer and demanded that Korea north of the 39th parallel served as a neutral zone. As negotiations broke down, the Japanese opted to go to war, staging a surprise attack in the Imperial Russian Navy at Port Arthur on February 8, 1904. Japan formally declared war against Russia on the day of the Port Arthur attack, but leaders of the Russian Empire did not receive notice of Japan's intentions until 7 hours after the Asian power had attacked Port Arthur, which had served the Russian Navy's base of operations in the region. Tsar Nicholas had been told by his advisors that the Japanese would not challenge Russia militarily, even after negotiations between the two powers had collapsed. International law did not require a formal declaration of war prior to launching an attack until the Second Hague Peace Conference of 1907, 2 years after fighting between the Russians and Japanese had ended. The attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy against the Russian Far East Fleet at Port Arthur was designed to neutralize the Russians. Under the leadership of Admiral Togo Hinachiro, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent torpedo boats to attack Russian naval vessels, significantly damaging the three of the largest: Cesarevich, Rezavin, and Palada. The assuring Battle of Port Arthur began the next day. All through the rest of the Russian Far Fleet was largely protected within the harbor at Port Arthur, the attack successfully dissuaded the Russians from taking the battle to the open seas, even though attempts to establish a Japanese blockade of the port failed. However, the Russian ships that evaded the Japanese did not escape unscathed. On April 12, 1904, the Petropavlovsk and Pobeda battleships were able to leave Port Arthur, but they struck mines just after leaving out to sea. The Petropavlovsk sank, while Pobeda limped back to the port and heavily damaged. While Russia avenged that attack with mines of its own, severely damaging 2 Japanese battleships. The Asian power retained the upper hand at Port Arthur but continued to bombard the harbor with heavy shelling. After attempts to attack Russian fortifications on land failed, resulting in significant casualties for the Japanese, the Asian power's persistence eventually paid off. In late August, forces from northern Russia sent to assist the fleet at Port Arthur were pushed back by the Japanese at the Battle of Liaoyang, and from newly gained positions on land in the vicinity of the harbor, Japanese guns fired relentlessly on Japanese ships moored in the bay. By the end of 1904, the Imperial Japanese Navy had sunk every ship in Russia's Pacific Fleet and had gained control of its garrison on a hill overlooking the harbor. In early January 1905, Russian Major General Anatoly Stachel, commander of the Port Arthur garrison, decided to surrender, and much to the surprise of both Japanese and his bosses in Moscow, believing that the harbor was no longer worth defending. In the face of significant losses with that, the Japanese had achieved a significant victory in the war. Stachel was later convinced of treason and sentenced to death for his decision, though he was ultimately pardoned. The Russian Navy sustained heavy losses during the Battle of Yellow Sea, enforcing the empire's leader to mobilize their Baltic fleet to the region as reinforcements. With the Russians distracted and demoralized, the Japanese ground forces set about controlling the Korean peninsula after landing at Incheon in modern-day South Korea. Within 2 months, they had taken over Seoul and the rest of the peninsula. At the end of April 1904, the Japanese ground forces began planning an attack on Russian-controlled Manchuria in northeastern China. During the first land battle of the war, the Battle of the Yalu River, the Japanese mounted a successful attack against a Russian detachment on May 1904, forcing them to retreat back toward Port Arthur. With fighting and tournament during the Manchurian winter, the next notable land battle in the conflict began on February 20th, 1905, when Japanese forces attacked the Russians at Mukden. The days of harsh fighting ensued, able to push back the Russians at the flanks. The Japanese eventually forced them into full retreat on March 10th. After 3 weeks of fighting, the Russians suffered significant casualties and they were pushed back to northern Mukden in northeastern China. During the first land battle of the war, the Battle of the Yalu River, the Japanese mounted a successful attack against a Russian detachment on May 1904, forcing them to retreat back toward Port Arthur. With fighting and tournament during the Manchurian winter, the next notable land battle in the conflict began on February 20th, 1905, when Japanese forces attacked the Russians at Mukden. The days of harsh fighting ensued, able to push back the Russians at the flanks. The Japanese eventually forced them into full retreat on March 10th. After 3 weeks of fighting, the Russians suffered significant casualties and they were pushed back to northern Mukden. Although the Japanese had achieved an important victory during the Battle of Mukden, they too sustained significant casualties. Ultimately, it was their navy that they won them the war. With Russia's Baltic fleet finally arriving as reinforcements in May 1905 after sailing nearly 20,000 miles, a monumental task especially in the early 1900s, they still faced the daunting challenges of having to navigate the Sea of Japan to get to Vladivostok, with Port Arthur no longer opening to them. Opting to sail at night to avoid detection, the Russian reinforcements were soon discovered by the Japanese, after its hospital ships opted to burn their lights in the darkness. Again, under the command of Togo Hinachiro, the Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to block the Russians' path to Vladivostok, and that engaged them at the Battle of Satsuma Strait on May 27, 1905. By the end of the next day, the Russians had lost 8 battleships, more than 5,000 men, only 3 vessels, and ultimately made it to their destination. The decisive victory forced the Russians to pursue a peace agreement. In the end, the Russo and Japanese War was a particularly brutal one, foreshadowing the global conflicts that were there to follow. It's believed that both sides sustained casualties mounting more than 150,000 combined, and that some 20,000 Chinese civilians were killed as well. Many of these civilian deaths were attributed to harsh tactics of the Russians in Manchuria. Journalists covering the war suggested that the Russians looted and burned several villages and raped many of the women that were living there. The fighting concluded with the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. During the spring and summer of 1905, negotiating for Russia was Sergei Witt, I hope I pronounced that name right, a minister in Tsar Nicholas' government. A Harvard graduate, Baron Karamura, represented Japan. Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the talks. As a result, Japan did not have the negotiation power as many people expected. Under the terms of the treaty, which was signed by both parties on September 5, 1905, Russia turned over Port Arthur to the Japanese while retaining the northern half of Sakhalin Island, which lies off its Pacific coast, which the Russians would gain control of the southern half and after World War II. Importantly, Roosevelt sided with Tsar Nicholas in refusal to pay indemnities to Japan. The Japanese accused the Americans of cheating them, and the days of anti-American rioting in Tokyo ensued. This Asian nation would later question America's role in Asian affairs during the lead-up to World War II. The Russians also agreed to leave Manchuria and recognize Japanese control of the Korean peninsula. The Empire of Japan would annex Korea 5 years later, an act that would have important repercussions during and after World War II. The costly and humiliating series of Russian defeats in the Russo and Japanese War left the Russian Empire demoralized and adding to Russians' growing more anger at the failed policies of Tsar Nicholas II, and would fan the flames of political dissent that ultimately resulted the overthrow of the Tsarist government during the Russian Revolution of 1917. Although the tensions in the region were far from over, the Russo and Japanese War did shift the bounds of a global power, making the first time in modern history that an Asian nation had defeated a European nation in military combat ever since the Mongols. And it would also mark the beginning of warfare involving world powers in the Pacific region. So that's the history of the Russo and Japanese War. I hope you guys like it. Please like and give it a comment too, as well as a subscribe, and please click the little bell to get you notified. I have some news for the channel. I'm planning to do a 1920s collaboration with 10 YouTubers. But it was supposed to be at November 1st, but the problem was that my grandfather died a couple weeks ago. He passed away, so it was really hard for me to to get everything back together. So I decided to change it up a bit. Probably we're gonna do the collaboration on mid-November or early December. So that's pretty much what the news is, on about the channel. So, alright, so like I said, give the video a like, comment, tell me what you think, and subscribe and click that little bell so you guys get notified. So, alright, so this is History Man out. Take care.